Flight attendant slaps black woman, not knowing she's the billionaire who owns the plane. The sun reflected off the sleek exterior of the private jet as passengers strolled onto the aircraft, their presence exuding wealth and importance. Inside, the cabin was a masterpiece of luxury. Polished mahogany panels, gold accents, and plush leather seats that promised an effortless journey. It was a place where exclusivity wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Among those boarding was Selena Mitchell, a composed woman in her late 30s. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and slacks, she exuded quiet confidence, carrying herself with the grace of someone who didn't need to prove her worth to anyone. To the untrained eye, she was simply another passenger. Another business traveler. But Selena was far more than that. This flight wasn't just another trip. It was a journey to oversee the growing empire she had built with her own hands. Standing near the entrance was Victoria Hale, the lead flight attendant, her uniform pristine, her expression carefully neutral. She prided herself on her ability to maintain control over the cabin, ensuring that the experience remained polished and refined. To her, order was everything. But order in Victoria's world often depended on how people looked, how they carried themselves, and whether or not they fit the unspoken mold of belonging. As she greeted passengers, her tone shifted depending on who stood before her. For Richard and Margaret Caldwell, a well-dressed older couple, she beamed warmly. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell. Lovely to have you flying with us again," she said, her voice honeyed with genuine warmth. Margaret gave a polite nod, already settling into her knitting, while Richard unfolded his newspaper, barely acknowledging the greeting. Then came Selena. The moment she stepped forward, Victoria's welcoming expression cooled by a few degrees. The enthusiasm in her voice dulled. "Welcome aboard," she said curtly, her smile polite but lacking warmth. The shift was subtle, yet obvious enough for Selena to notice. She had seen this before. It was in the brief hesitation, the micro-expression of doubt, the slight flicker of reluctance before professionalism took over. She wasn't surprised, but she was taking note. Without a word, she moved past Victoria and toward her seat, her calm demeanor unwavering. As passengers settled in, the flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin. Victoria ensured the Caldwells were comfortable, offering them refreshments with the kind of effortless grace reserved for valued guests. Meanwhile, Selena sat silently, watching. Victoria had passed by her seat more than once, never offering so much as a glance, let alone the same level of service she extended to others. Selena, ever patient, said nothing. She simply observed. She knew what was coming. Selena adjusted her seatbelt and glanced around the lavish cabin. The other passengers had already settled in, engaged in quiet conversations or absorbed in their own distractions. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell flipped through his newspaper, occasionally glancing over his reading glasses to assess the scene. His wife, Margaret, busied herself with knitting, her hands moving in a rhythmic dance. Everything about them exuded comfort and familiarity, as though they had taken this flight 100 times before. Because they had. Meanwhile, Selena sat poised, her back straight, her hands resting gently in her lap. She belonged here just as much as they did, but there was an unspoken question in the air. A silent challenge that came not from the passengers, but from Victoria Hale, the flight attendant who was now making her way through the aisle. Victoria's sharp eyes swept over the cabin, ensuring that everything was in order. Her presence was commanding, her posture rigid with control. She had worked these flights for years, catering to the elite, curating an atmosphere of exclusivity. And yet, something about Selena unsettled her. It wasn't the way she dressed. Her tailored attire was impeccable. It wasn't her behavior. She exuded an effortless composure that was almost intimidating. No, what troubled Victoria was the way Selena sat, unbothered, unafraid, and completely sure of herself. That confidence, so unwavering, made Victoria uncomfortable. Steeling herself, Victoria approached. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but clipped. "I believe you're in the wrong section." Selena looked up, her expression unreadable. "No, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she responded evenly, her voice smooth and unwavering. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She had expected hesitation, an apology, perhaps even a flustered response. Instead, she was met with calm certainty. "This section is reserved for our elite passengers," she emphasized, hoping to drive her point home. Selina didn't blink. "You might want to double-check your manifest before making assumptions." For a brief moment, Victoria hesitated, her confidence wavering. But rather than admit fault, she straightened her posture, doubling down. "I don't need to check anything," she said, forcing a tight smile. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." A subtle tension rippled through the cabin. The soft hum of conversation faltered as nearby passengers tuned into the exchange. A businessman across the aisle, who had been absent-mindedly stirring his drink, glanced up with mild curiosity. A younger woman in designer sunglasses shifted slightly in her seat, intrigued by the confrontation unfolding before her. Selina held Victoria's gaze unflinching. "Then you should have no problem explaining why I don't belong." A beat of silence. Victoria's jaw tightened. She could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her now, the mounting scrutiny pressing down on her every word. Frustration flared in her chest, her authority being questioned in a way she hadn't expected. "If you don't move to the back of the plane," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly, "I will have to call security." Selina exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. Then, with quiet finality, she spoke. "Call whoever you need to, but I'm not moving." The air inside the cabin thickened as Victoria's words settled over the passengers. A few exchanged uncertain glances, while others pretended not to hear, suddenly very interested in their phones or in staring blankly at their champagne glasses. The businessman across the aisle leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms, his brow furrowed as he studied the scene. Selina, however, remained unshaken. She had faced challenges before, greater challenges than this moment, greater people than Victoria, and she would not be intimidated by a woman clinging desperately to her self-assigned authority. Victoria, still expecting submission, tilted her head with an exasperated sigh. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I will not ask again," she warned, her voice sharp enough to slice through the murmurs around them. Selina, ever poised, simply tilted her head. "Then stop asking," she replied smoothly. A soft gasp came from somewhere in the cabin. Margaret Caldwell, who had been quietly knitting, paused mid-stitch, her eyes flicking toward Victoria, then back to Selina. Richard lowered his newspaper just enough to peer over it, his curiosity piqued. Grace, the junior flight attendant standing a few feet away, looked visibly uneasy, her fingers tightening around the passenger list she had been holding. Victoria's face hardened. She was used to obedience, used to being in control. The resistance she was facing now was a challenge she wasn't prepared for, and it was infuriating. She turned to Grace, her voice clipped. "Escort her to the back now." Grace hesitated. The discomfort in her expression was evident. She had seen Victoria in action before, had witnessed the way she exerted her power selectively. But this was different. The entire cabin was watching. And something about the way Selina carried herself made Grace pause. "Maybe we should check the manifest," Grace offered cautiously, her voice quieter than intended. Victoria's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." Grace swallowed. "It won't take long," she tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's nostrils flared as she clenched her jaw. "I don't need a manifest to tell me what I already know," she hissed before turning back to Selina. "I don't care how calm you think you are. You don't belong here." Selina's patience, while vast, had its limits. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her phone. She didn't rush, didn't panic. Instead, she typed something quickly, her fingers moving with quiet precision before placing the device back onto the armrest beside her. "What do you think you're doing?" Victoria snapped, a flicker of unease creeping into her tone. Selina met her gaze, her expression unshaken. "You'll find out soon enough," she said simply. The businessman across the aisle smirked, shaking his head slightly, as though recognizing a battle Victoria had already lost but hadn't yet realized. The younger woman in the designer sunglasses, who had been watching with growing interest, now had her phone subtly raised, recording the exchange. Victoria's frustration boiled over. "You're causing a scene," she accused, her voice now tinged with desperation. From his seat, Richard Caldwell scoffed under his breath. "From where I'm sitting, you're the only one causing a scene." he muttered, earning an approving nod from his wife. Victoria's face burned with frustration. "I've had enough of this," she announced, her voice rising. "Either you move, or I'll make sure you're escorted off this plane." Selina remained composed, her eyes locked onto Victoria's with an unnerving steadiness. "You can try," she said softly. For the first time, Victoria hesitated. Something about Selina's tone sent a shiver of unease through her. For the first time, doubt crept in. The passengers were watching, the cameras were recording, and Victoria was quickly realizing that she had made a mistake, one that she could no longer take back. Victoria's confidence, once so unshakable, began to waver under the weight of Selina's unyielding composure. The flight attendant had expected resistance, but not like this. Not calm, unwavering defiance that carried a quiet authority. The tension in the cabin had escalated past the point of subtle whispers and exchanged glances. The passengers weren't just watching. They were witnessing something they knew would not end quietly. Grace still hesitated at Victoria's command, her grip tightening around the passenger list. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Victoria snapped again, this time louder, more aggressive. "Grace, I gave you an order. Escort her to the back. Now." Selina exhaled slowly, shaking her head ever so slightly. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice a smooth contrast to the sharpness of Victoria's. Victoria scoffed, masking her growing discomfort with hostility. "The only mistake I see here is you thinking you can dictate how things work on this flight." She straightened her posture, as if physically trying to regain control. "You don't belong in this seat, and you don't get to argue with crew members." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. Selina's eyes narrowed just slightly. There it was, the unspoken truth behind all of this. It was never about a seat. It was about Victoria's perception of who deserved to be here and who didn't. "I belong exactly where I am," Selina said, her voice unwavering. Victoria's lips curled into a sneer. "You think so?" Selina didn't flinch. "I know so." The businessman across the aisle, Richard Caldwell, cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. His wife, Margaret, nodded in agreement, setting her knitting aside. Victoria, sensing that she was losing control of the situation, doubled down. She turned to the passengers, appealing for validation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption," she announced, her tone adopting the forced politeness of someone who believed she was still in charge. "Unfortunately, we have a passenger who refuses to follow simple instructions." Some passengers remained silent, unsure of what to do. But others, including Richard Caldwell, were unimpressed. "You mean the instructions that don't actually apply?" he challenged, raising an eyebrow. Victoria's jaw clenched. The socialite sitting near the front, who had been watching like it was a front-row Broadway show, let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh, this just got interesting," she whispered to her seatmate, who nodded in agreement. Grace took an uneasy step forward, as though preparing to finally intervene. "Maybe we should." But before she could finish, Victoria turned abruptly, her frustration boiling over. With no warning, she grabbed the glass of water from her service tray and tipped it forward, sending the icy liquid spilling onto Selina's lap. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Selina inhaled sharply, not in shock, but in measured control. Her body tensed slightly from the cold, but her expression never changed. If anything, she looked disappointed. "Oops," Victoria said, voice dripping with mock innocence. "You should really watch where you put your hands." The businessman across the aisle let out a sharp breath. "Oh, you've really done it now." Selina exhaled, slow and deliberate, before reaching for a napkin and dabbing at her blazer. Then she calmly placed the napkin down, lifted her phone, and without saying a word, snapped a single picture. Victoria's smirk faltered. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice no longer as certain. Selina glanced at her phone screen, then set it gently onto the armrest. "Documenting," she said simply. Another ripple of murmurs ran through the cabin. More phones appeared, subtly but deliberately raised. Passengers who had once tried to ignore the commotion were now fully engaged, their eyes locked onto the scene unfolding before them. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, her authority slipping faster than she could grasp it. "You think taking a picture is going to change anything?" Selina tilted her head, considering the question. Then she smiled. Just slightly. You'll find out soon enough. And with that, the power shifted completely. Victoria's smirk had faded completely. The moment Selena snapped that picture, the situation shifted from an isolated confrontation to something much bigger. Passengers murmured, their eyes darting between Victoria and Selena, sensing the rapid unraveling of control. Victoria may have held authority over the cabin, but she was beginning to realize she had no power over perception. And that was something she had never prepared for. Selena, unfazed by the tension around her, set her phone down gently on the armrest. The small smile she had offered before lingered, but there was something new in her expression now, something measured, something definitive. "You should really think before you act," she said quietly, her voice calm but carrying enough weight that even those seated further back could feel the shift. Victoria's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "Think before I act," she repeated, incredulous. "Are you threatening me?" Selena leaned back slightly, lifting an eyebrow. "If accountability feels like a threat, then that's something you might want to reflect on." Richard Caldwell, the businessman who'd been observing the exchange with increasing interest, let out a low chuckle. "Now, that's a line I'll remember." The tension in the air grew thicker as Victoria glanced around the cabin, realizing that the tide was turning against her. The passengers who had once seemed indifferent were no longer passive observers. Some were recording discreetly. Others were murmuring their disapproval. A few shook their heads, unimpressed with Victoria's behavior. And then Grace, the junior flight attendant, finally found her voice. "Victoria," she started hesitantly, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "Maybe we should." Victoria whipped around, her face flushed with frustration. "Stay out of this, Grace." Grace flinched slightly, but to her credit, she didn't back down. "I really think we should check the passenger list." Her voice was shaky, but there was something firm beneath it. She told us to check, and we didn't." Selena remained still, her gaze resting on Grace, with something that looked almost like encouragement. Victoria scoffed, shaking her head. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. But the discomfort in her posture betrayed her bravado. Then, from the front of the plane, the cockpit door swung open. The pilot, a composed, middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, stepped out, his eyes scanning the cabin as if assessing the situation in an instant. He walked down the aisle with controlled, measured steps, stopping just short of Victoria. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. Victoria turned quickly, as if hoping to spin the situation to her advantage. "Captain, we have a passenger refusing to comply with instructions," she began, her voice laced with false professionalism. Selena exhaled through her nose, the corners of her lips twitching upward. The captain's gaze flickered toward Selena, before landing back on Victoria. His expression remained unreadable. And what instruction exactly was that? Victoria hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She's sitting in the wrong section," Victoria finally said, grasping for control. The captain turned his head slightly, glancing at Selena, whose composure had remained unwavering. Then, without a word, he extended a hand toward Grace. "Flight manifest," he said simply. Grace, looking both relieved and terrified, immediately retrieved the clipboard hanging near the galley and handed it over. The captain took it, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. The entire cabin was silent. Then, the captain found what he was looking for. His eyebrows lifted slightly before his lips pressed into a firm line. He turned the clipboard around, holding it up for Victoria to see. Selena's name was listed in first-class seating. A sharp inhale rippled through the passengers. Victoria's entire body tensed. The captain's voice, while still measured, carried an unmistakable finality. "It appears you've made a grave mistake." Selena, watching the moment unfold, finally let out a small breath. She had known all along, of course, but watching the realization dawn on Victoria in real time, that was something else entirely. And now, there was no turning back. The silence that followed the captain's statement was deafening. The weight of his words settled over the cabin like a dense fog, thick, with unspoken implications. Every passenger, every crew member, every single person present could feel it, the moment when everything shifted, when the last shred of Victoria's authority crumbled beneath the reality of her mistake. Selina remained perfectly composed. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even so much as raise an eyebrow. She simply sat there, steady as ever, as if she had known this outcome was inevitable. And in truth, she had. Victoria, on the other hand, was unraveling. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. She looked at the clipboard again, as if hoping the letters on the page would miraculously rearrange themselves, erasing her error. But the name Selina Carter was printed clearly in black ink, right there in first class, indisputable and immovable. Passengers shifted in their seats. Some exchanged glances, others checked their phones, and a few discreetly recorded the scene unfolding before them. The nosy socialite, who had been watching the entire encounter with rapt attention, whispered something to her seatmate, shaking her head. Richard Caldwell, the businessman who had been observing from across the aisle, leaned back with a satisfied smirk. "Well," he murmured just loud enough for those around him to hear. "That's awkward." Grace, the junior flight attendant, clutched the edge of the service tray in her hands, her knuckles white. She wanted to feel relieved, vindicated even, but there was something deeply unsettling about watching Victoria, her superior, the woman who had commanded authority with such unwavering certainty, realize she had lost control. The captain exhaled sharply through his nose, the only outward sign of his growing impatience. "Miss Carter?" he said, his tone now shifting from formal to professional courtesy. "I sincerely apologize for this unnecessary disruption. You are, of course, exactly where you're supposed to be." Selina nodded once, acknowledging his words but offering nothing more. Victoria's face burned red. Whether it was anger, embarrassment, or both, it didn't matter. Everyone could see it. She wasn't just caught in a mistake, she was exposed. The captain shifted his focus back to Victoria. "And you," he said, his voice now carrying a distinct edge of authority, "owe this passenger an apology." If possible, the tension in the air thickened. Passengers sat up straighter, eyes darting between Victoria and the captain, knowing that this was the moment of reckoning. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. She swallowed hard. Her pride was a heavy thing, weighing down her every movement. Apologizing, especially publicly, was something she wasn't accustomed to, let alone to someone she had so clearly mistreated. Selina waited, her expression unreadable. The seconds stretched long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Victoria forced out the words. "I apologize," she said, her voice clipped barely above a whisper. The captain's eyes narrowed. Louder. Victoria's jaw tightened, her nostrils flaring as she took a breath. "I apologize," she said again, this time with enough volume for the passengers around her to hear. But it was stiff, mechanical. There was no sincerity behind it, no recognition of the damage she had done. Selina studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Acknowledged," she said, her tone cool but composed. "Though an apology only means something if you truly understand what you're apologizing for." The statement landed hard, and the murmurs of approval from the surrounding passengers confirmed it. Victoria looked like she wanted to shrink into the floor. The captain glanced at Grace. "Escort Miss Carter to a private seat in the front," he said, "and ensure she has whatever she needs." He then turned back to Victoria, his tone final. "We will be discussing this further when we land." And with that, the shift was complete. Victoria had come into this confrontation believing she had the power, that she dictated who belonged and who didn't. But now, the entire plane had witnessed the truth. Power wasn't about control, it was about integrity. And in the end, Selina had proven which one of them truly held it. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. The once tense silence had been replaced by quiet murmurs, whispered conversations weaving through the rows of seats like a current shifting beneath the surface. The weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air, undeniable and unforgettable. Selina sat in her seat at the front of the plane, her posture as composed as ever. She had not asked for any special treatment, nor had she sought to make a spectacle of the situation. But it had happened nonetheless, and now the consequences of that moment stretched far beyond just herself and Victoria. Across the aisle, Richard Caldwell glanced up from his phone, his expression one of quiet admiration. He had seen many power plays in his time, boardroom battles, political maneuvering, but what had just occurred on this flight was something entirely different. It was not about business or strategy. It was about dignity, about the quiet power of self-respect and the refusal to be diminished. A few rows back, the nosy socialite, who had at first whispered her doubts about Selena, now looked down at her own hands, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. She had spent years moving through the world with a certain level of privilege, rarely questioning the way things worked or who was deemed worthy of the spaces she occupied. But now, after witnessing how easily someone could be dismissed, could be belittled simply for existing in a space where they rightfully belonged, she felt an unfamiliar twinge of shame. Grace, the junior flight attendant, moved through the aisle with a newfound sense of purpose. She no longer hesitated as she passed by Selena's seat, no longer averted her gaze. Instead, she met Selena's eyes and offered a small but sincere nod of respect. It was subtle, but it was meaningful, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the best thing one could do was stand up for what was right, even in the smallest of ways. And then there was Victoria. She remained stationed near the galley, away from the watchful eyes of the passengers, her posture stiff, her mind no doubt racing through the events that had just unfolded. The humiliation, the loss of control, the undeniable truth that she had been wrong, it clung to her like a second skin. Whether or not she would learn from it was a question only time would answer. But one thing was certain, the moment had left its mark, not just on Selena, not just on Victoria, but on everyone who had witnessed it. Because injustice, once seen, could never be unseen, and respect, once demanded, would never again be denied. As the plane neared its destination, the passengers settled into a contemplative quiet. The tension that had once crackled through the cabin had faded, replaced by a solemn awareness that they had all been part of something much bigger than an uncomfortable confrontation. What had started as a simple flight had turned into a defining moment, one that would ripple far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Selena gazed out of the window, the sky stretching endlessly before her. She knew that what had happened today would follow her, not in the form of regret or anger, but as a reminder of why she carried herself the way she did. People like Victoria would always exist, those who judged, those who assumed, those who believed that power came from control rather than respect. But people like Grace, like Richard Caldwell, like the passengers who had dared to question what they saw, those people mattered just as much. They were proof that the world was still capable of learning. At the back of the plane, Victoria remained out of sight, humiliated, her face still flushed with the weight of her actions. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, that her authority on this plane was absolute. And yet, in a single moment, that belief had crumbled. She had not only been wrong, she had been exposed. Whether she would carry that lesson with her or dismiss it as an unfortunate incident was a choice only she could make. Grace, on the other hand, had already made her choice. She had seen injustice firsthand, had felt the helplessness of wanting to do the right thing, but fearing the consequences. Today had shown her that silence was a choice, too, and not one she was willing to make anymore. As the plane began its descent, the flight intercom crackled to life, breaking the silence with the captain's smooth, practiced voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for arrival." Selena took a deep breath and leaned back in her seat. The journey had been more than just miles traveled. It had been a reminder of who she was and what she stood for. And as the wheels touched the ground, she knew that long after this flight ended, the lesson it carried would remain. Because respect, once claimed, could never again be ignored.